This is Tom McCullough. McCullough.
Here we are.
All right. Sorry about that. I think Riverside just went kapoop on me. So it's always good to have a plan B, but I
Yeah,
appreciate
exactly.
you. So we're using Zoom instead. It's recording right now, so we're good. And what I'll do is a team, make sure you go ahead and just adjust this. We won't start over because we still got the other recording, but we'll
Yeah.
just kind of, carry on just through the system. So I don't
Okay.
think anybody will notice, but awesome. So Tom, all right. Tom, I really appreciate you explaining this. And so one of the things I want to ask you a little bit is really the structure of, a lot of this communication, right? Between families, between these conversations with the parents as well as the kids and that succession plan. And really making sure you're including these individuals to the next phase. Some love to talk about money and talk about where it's all going. Some people don't like to talk too much about it. But there needs to be this dialogue and this conversation, this communication. And I want to ask you, how do you navigate that with your clients and structuring maybe a methodology and a process to, facilitate good growth communication?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is the most common question people ask is making sure that, or how do I ensure that my kids develop well, develop as individuals, have all the skills they need in life, and how do I make sure my money does not restrict that? It's a strange thing that because money can be it's an amplifier of all things. It provides many opportunities, but it also provides some risks that kids don't fully develop because parents step in and rescue them and use money and power to do that. So it's really a challenge. I think it depends on there is no rule of thumb that a child should be a certain age to be informed of the money or receive money. There's lots of different views out there. One of the fellows who wrote in our book said, I've done this for 40 or 50 years, and I have come to believe that the next generation should not receive significant amounts of money until they're in their 40s because they need to, he calls it, earn their way into adulthood. And how do you earn your way into adulthood? You do independent things. You get a job. Maybe you have a mortgage. You have paid some bills. Maybe you've gotten married. Maybe there's a child. But all those are adult things. And so his view from advising families for many years is that, you know, uh, we should wait and not give it to them too soon because they really haven't had the opportunity to develop normally and naturally. Now, on the other hand, there are many people who who disclose the amounts of money and give money earlier. And it's not right or wrong. It depends very much on the person, the child, and the parent. But what I will say is it's never too early to start the process of education. And I think there's, you've probably heard, or your listeners have probably heard of the idea of, three jars. When kids get allowance, a third of it goes into spending money, a third saving, and a third for philanthropy, for example. And and then as kids get a little bit older, maybe the idea is to give them an opportunity to do something firsthand, to actually be taught, take a course, but also to maybe they get a small portfolio to manage and they have to work with an advisor to figure things out. And then maybe if you are going to join a family board, you have to have taken a couple of courses that are going to start to educate you, on how to be a good beneficiary or how to be a good director. So I think that the process, of course, is customized to the family, but it's never too early to start the process of educating the next generation on money. And by the way, there's a follow-up book to that, the first book, and it's called Wealth of Wisdom, also, but it's the top practices for wealthy families and their advisors. And there's some great practices in there that families have used to do exactly what we're talking about. How do you educate the next generation? What's a good process? What are good tools to do that?
Well, see, it was interesting because I've talked to some individuals where they facilitate this conversation of, hey, you know what, our kids automatically get a director position once they turn a specific age, and then there are some, and I've talked to as well, which I can like gravitate toward this kind of region a little bit more. So is there are certain, just like you were saying, there are certain educational things that they have to complete a check mark before they get a director position or getting allocated or getting some sort of resource before you get a voting right. Now, it doesn't mean you get access to the money, but you get some sort of voting right. And what I found interesting also is you thinking, some family offices I've talked to where they are thinking third generation, fourth generation, right? How to preserve this wealth to that next level. And you and I know the compounding effect of family members, right? All of a sudden you have four kids, they all have four kids, and they all have four kids. I mean, it explodes very quickly. I was had the opportunity to talk to one seventh generation, and he says that they still, as a family, as a whole family, they still, I think, once a year or once a quarter or once every 6 months, they all try to get everybody together. But now that family reunion is like 500 people, right? It's everybody, right? And so, but what I found very interesting is they still get together. They make an initiative to, a prioritization to facilitate those relationships and communication, in that regard. Do you and I know everything is contextual. It's depending upon each family, the way they want to, present it. I just want to ask you, with the creativity of some of these families. What have you seen thus far in regards to maybe the structure that they put in? Like you mentioned, I think that was kind of cool. Waiting till 40 years old, they've gone through enough life before they get access to some of the pool of money. I thought that was kind of a cool idea. What other kind of creative ideas have you seen that some of these families have put in place?
Yeah, there's lots of different ones. One that we use for a lot of families when in answering the question, when is a good time to give money to kids, is we call it the milestone approach. So instead of giving, and keep in mind, our families are sort of 30 million to a billion in family net worth. So that's what we're talking about. And so the milestone approach, well, I guess the other alternative is a lump sum too early. So giving $5 million to an 18-year-old. So that's the one extreme. Probably not a good idea. Or you got to do it with all sorts of supports. The other side of it is what we call a milestone approach is give the next generation some money at the milestone points of their life. So one of them is funding education. Another one maybe is a chunk of money when they are when they graduate. Maybe what's the biggest spending years of your life? Buying a house, starting a family, and because I guess the third alternative is one is money too early. The middle one is milestone approach, and the third is, well, I don't want to ruin the kids, and I don't know if it's going to mess up the kids. And you realize you're talking to an 80-year-old and their kids are 60 and they're worried about screwing up the kids. So that's not good either. And sometimes family members aren't even told about the money because nobody wants to ruin the kids. So it's this very interesting dance. And I have talked to so many people, and and all the different approaches. And you'll tell somebody, about waiting till they're 40, and their view is I told my kids at 16 and they've been fantastic and we've worked with them. And so there's a lot of solutions. One example just to give you about creative ideas is several, I'll say, of our clients use philanthropy as a education tool, and they will use the family foundation and either or both bring the next generation to be a part of the family foundation to make decisions, and or they will give them a certain amount of money, $20,000 or $50,000 a year for them to give away and teach them how to do due diligence and maybe even manage a portion of that money. So those are the types of things, but more and more, I think that families are trying to become learning families, and constantly learning. And some people do it via trips. They go on a development trip together, or they go and visit. If they've got private equity holdings, they'll bring the next generation to these meetings, go and see the building they own, go and see a business that they own. So there's just so many great creative ideas. But what I would say is there's probably an awful lot more money invested or spent by families in developing their investment portfolio and their tax structuring than they ever spend on education. So there's a lot of money spent preparing the wealth for the next generation, but very little money and time spent on preparing the next generation for the wealth.
I think that is so key for a lot of listeners, as well as myself, and the way I think about this. Because you're exactly right. There's so many of our time, energy, and effort that we spend building the structure, thinking about the structure, how to preserve that wealth, and then all of a sudden we don't ever actually teach people how to leverage it. And money is really a lot of mindset of and the way we think about it, and the relationship. I think that was really cool what you mentioned in regards to how they integrate philanthropy into education for their kids, right? Being able to integrate them. But like you, I've seen where they've included them drastically in a lot of their portfolio companies that they have, and saying, hey, you know what? You're going to go and work at this ABC company on the forefront, learn work ethic, learn kind of the accounting, learn all that stuff, and then maybe be able to get into the holding company as well and get access to it. So there's a lot of different creative ways. So I appreciate you just kind of, sharing that a little bit. What I also want to ask you a little bit, and when you're working with some of these families, I'm always curious. It is like a business, right? Where there is a CEO and they have to make the executive decision. However, though, sometimes you have the board, sometimes you have the C-suite, and there are conflict of interest, right? Or maybe not conflict of interest, but there's different ideas. And that's what you want. You want diversity, you want different of opinion, which help facilitate growth in the thing. But at the end of the day, someone has to make it a decision, and they all have to, then all the C-suite and the board, they all have to align on that decision and move the company or move the family's wealth forward. So I'm curious the conversation and the delegation and the respect to ensure that there are certain because I mean, at the end of the day, there's some ego that gets in the way, right? Well, you know what, Billy Bob doesn't like me. That's in politics and all that fun stuff. But there are certain things you can mitigate that. I don't think you can totally get rid of it, but just like in a corporate world, there are certain things you can mitigate that drastically, and then being able to still facilitate growth and movement. So, what have you noticed where the communication definitely as the family gets larger and there's more conflicting ideas and mindsets and whatever that help facilitate the growth kind of mindset in regards to conversation communication, definitely at an executive level?
Yeah. Yeah, it's very true. I will say that, interestingly enough, the majority of our clients are first generation wealth clients. So guess who's in charge? Dad or dad and mom. And so while there's other people involved in the process, and it's usually bringing in the next generation to help educate them, dad often has the mom and dad, but realistically, it's often dad has the final say, and yet they speak out of both sides of their mouth because they want to involve the next generation, and the next generation saying, great, fine, but give us a little bit of authority, and often mom and dad are kind of like, well, I'm not ready. So that's an interesting challenge in and of itself. What you're talking about usually is when they've kind of gotten past that and there are other family members involved in the business or the wealth. And by the way, just before I move to that, it is interesting, how much of wealth today is first or second generation. The large bulk of wealth is has been created by the person that I'm dealing with. That's really certainly in North America, maybe a little bit less so in Europe and other places where it's inherited, but it's much of it is first generation wealth. So the governance issues, and governance really is just a fancy word for how do you make decisions about shared assets. It's simpler in some ways because the wealth is still controlled by a person or a couple, but of course as the family grows and that founder is gone, and then you've got the siblings partnerships and cousin consortiums and so on. That's when governance becomes extremely important. How will you decide on shared assets, and how will ownership pass? Will it pass by the branch of the family? And what if that branch of the family only has one child, and this branch has 5 children, and this branch has 7 children? Do they share equally in the ownership of the assets, or is it all by branch? And how will decisions be made? It's very, very complicated, and it is. I think families do often reach out to experts, whether it's a family office or a consultant in that game, because they've never done it before. And guess what? Lots of other families have. So what they want is, what do other people do in this very complicated situation? And people like us and others can say, well, look here, there's 3 or 4 approaches that people take. And I think this one might be most relevant for you given your situation and circumstances.
Yeah, that's real. That's one of the reasons why I want to have you on is because you've worked with a lot of these clients, and I know, I mean, divorce is one of the big things as well. When you marry and then divorce, and what happens in that situation, and who has the voting rights, and how long, and et cetera, et cetera. And there's a lot of questions and so forth. And what's so fun is just, I shouldn't say fun, but it's so nice to hear where you have someone like yourself, Tom, that has experience navigating these conversations and these questions and these dialogues with so many of your clients, and you've been able to find really good creative paths, because not everything is cut and paste for each client. Everything is very contextual depending upon a lot of factors. And Tom, I really appreciate you being on here, man, and just talking deep about the structure of this, the way you think about this, the way you navigating each one of these clients, really the portfolio structure, as well as identifying and adjusting according to obviously the macro and the micro, and then the way you think about certain vehicles that will be able to strategically help them, and then also bridging that gap in education in regards to the governance of so many individuals and how to navigate those conversations with the families, thinking about generation 2, generation 3, and preserving that wealth. Tom, for those that want to reach out, maybe even actually read this book and consume your content, you got a lot of good content out there. How do they reach out to you, my man?
Well, I think the best way to do it is there's 2 websites. One is our company website, which is northwoodfamilyoffice.com, and my contact information is there. I'm the CEO of the firm. And the other one, if you're interested in the book, I mean, they're all available on Amazon. But if you're looking just to figure out kind of what's it all about, there's a website called wealthofwisdombook.com, and it's got information on both of those books. By the way, it's kind of interesting. I mentioned that we have multiple authors in the book, and what we did also is, once the book was done, we did podcast interviews with each of the authors. So there's 75 podcasts so far. We're still building; it'll get to 100. With if you want to drill down more, like for example, one of the questions is, how do we run a family meeting? So there's a chapter in the book, but if you want to hear for an hour or 40 minutes from Mary Duke, who wrote the chapter on how to have a family meeting in the first book, you can listen to me talking to Mary about that, or my co-author, Keith Whitaker. So there's just so much resources, and that's available just also on any podcast distributor as well, on Apple or Spotify. So lots of resources. We've always believed in sharing. We believe in helping to develop the industry and find ways to make it easier for ultra high net worth families to find their way through the maze, quite frankly, to a good solution for them and their family.
Yeah, sadly, you can't just get on YouTube and just find these questions, find these answers. You have to talk to someone like, yourself, Tom, and your team.
Yeah.
And guys, for those that are listening, to make it very simple, all those links are in the description below. So I would highly recommend. There's a lot of good content that he actually provides, white papers as well as the book, and even just like you mentioned, the podcast as well. Very, very resourceful in that regard. So all those links are in the description below. Guys, that is my guest, the one and only, my friend Tom McCullough. Guys, that is Journey with Christian, the Evans podcast. Until next time, be uncommon if you can.